Hey guys, Adam Noisy Guy DIY, and today I want to show you something I just finished up building. It is part of the Wood Art Challenge, where a bunch of friends of mine have gotten together and we have built our own version of wood wall art. There are about 30 people, 30 bloggers who have built their own. This is mine. I'm calling it the Cherry Java Clock because I can think of no better name. Even though it's terrible, I'm going to stick with it. But it's made of live edge cherry, epoxy, and coffee, and I also made it a clock. So stay tuned, watch the full video, and oh yeah, make sure you go to the link and check out all the other builds because they are awesome. Check it out, guys. First up, I have this awesome piece of live edge cherry that had a big split down the middle. I want to have some straight edges, so I grab my speed square and I start marking straight lines. Because I don't have a flush edge on the live edge to go against the fence of the table saw, I made a little sled just by using a piece of plywood, and that actually runs against the fence of the saw, while the piece of live edge goes across the top and makes a straight cut. If it looks like I'm cutting slowly, it's because I am, because this stuff is so thick and so dense, it's hard to cut. This is where things started going crazy. Instead of filling in the middle like a normal epoxy project, I decided I was going to cut this into 4 pieces and turn this into a clock. Now that I have flush edges, I can use the miter saw and make cuts. But even with this big saw, I still have to cut slowly because this is a thick and dense piece of hardwood. So I don't want binding, and I definitely don't want pieces of wood flying back into my face. Now comes the fun part, or the stressful part. This is where I actually mix and match and try to figure out how I want these things to be arranged. There were definitely some trial and error, but I ultimately figured out what I wanted to do with it. And it looks like we hit it here finally. I am going to skip one part of this build, and that's the mold that we're pouring the epoxy into. I just use plywood and 1x4s. I attach it with screws because that'll be easy to take apart later. But the important part is I tape the whole thing up with T-Rex tape. You can use duct tape as well, but you need something waterproof. I like T-Rex tape because it's good for the heat, because epoxy gives off heat and can make adhesive unstick. But the important part is cover all your gaps and holes to make sure it does not leak out epoxy everywhere. Pay attention because this is where I screwed up. You can see the green painter's tape on the inside around the edges. What I really should have done is continue to use my T-Rex tape on the inside and the bottom completely. That's what I've done on other projects because then once the mold is dry, it just pops right out. I did not do that this time. I don't know why. It caused a ton of problems later. Now for everybody's favorite motivator, it's time to add the coffee. I just grabbed the cheapest bags of whole bean coffee I could find at the store and just started pouring them in. You probably don't need as much because a little bit goes a long way with epoxy. Once you've arranged everything, it's time to prep your epoxy. I use a brand called East Coast Epoxy that I'll put in the notes, but it's a 2-part solution. You'll notice this is a little bit thicker that's going in now, and then I'll add the hardener, and then I will start mixing. And then I will mix and mix and mix some more. It'll start giving off heat when it starts working. You'll notice it slightly, but after you're done stirring, it's time to actually add whatever pigment or dye you want to add if you want a little bit of color. I use normal house paint or even acrylic craft paint. I've used dyes before. It all works, but 1 or 2 drops will color the entire thing. So you see how quickly it went milky. And now for the gooey fun part. It's time to start pouring that epoxy you just mixed. I'm going to pour a little in the middle here to start, just to get a base down, and then I'm going to focus only on one side. The reason for that is coffee beans absolutely float, so you don't want to fill it all the way up to the top if you want a different look like my final piece. I pour a little on this side to start with, I let it drain, and then I pour a little more in there, and then I don't do anything with the other side. I let this side dry, and then I go back with more epoxy later. This is actually the next day after the original batch of epoxy had dried. This is my final pour that I'm going to put in. It's pretty much the same color and the same makeup, but you can see on the left, the beans are not showing as much. You'll definitely see them on the side, but on the right-hand side, the beans are absolutely going to start floating. With the second batch poured, it's time to get the bubbles out. I just tap it with a rubber mallet, or you can use a blowtorch. That'll bring the bubbles to the surface. But most importantly, you want to make sure this is level when it dries so you have a clean, smooth edge. Just to make the look a little bit more dynamic, I start adding a drop or 2 of ink right into the epoxy before it dries. Not too much though, but then I take a spoon and start mixing it in. You don't want it just to be on the surface because you'll sand that off eventually when you start going through the epoxy in your finishing stage. But if you drag it through and make sure some of it gets onto the bottom layers, you'll have a pretty cool marble look. I mentioned it before, but I absolutely screwed up when I used painter's tape on the inside of the mold. Use the other tape that you were using on the outside because the painter's tape did not come off. I actually ended up having to cut it off later. But most importantly, it is time to sand. Everybody's favorite pastime. So I switched epoxies on the second pour, and I absolutely regret it because it was a inferior product. I'm gonna give you all the link to the good epoxy, but I had to sand and sand and sand some more. I ended up using ceramic discs from Shopsmith, which were fantastic. I started with a 36 grit and went all the way up to 220, but it took forever. With the sanding finished, it was time to pre-drill my holes for the clock movement. I started with a small bit and then worked my way up to a bigger one. Because this piece is thicker than a normal clock face, I'm going to have to route out an area specifically for the clock movement. So I mark it up and then I pull out my router. There's no need to be exact here. I just set my depth, add a downward spiral bit, and then just route away the area that I need and then drop the clock movement in to make sure it fits. Now for the sexy part, it's time for the oil up. I'm using Walrus oil. They make a cutting board oil that is great for live edge material. It works with the epoxy well too, but I just pour a generous amount on and just rub off the excess. After letting the oil cure overnight, it's time to put in the clock movement for good. I drop it in the back, and then I start attaching the hardware on the front and the hands of the clock. Put them on, and you are done with this project. It is a beautiful, unique piece with coffee, epoxy, and live edge material. If you need more details on this build or you're ready to check out the other builds in this challenge, head on over to LazyGuyDIY.com, keyword Wood Art Challenge.